You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a scientific point of view. Well, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I am still trying to crank out enough podcasts, take care of my vacation coming up, so I'm looking forward to that. And I hope you have a vacation coming up this summer that you can enjoy yourself, because obviously for many of you it is your busy time of year. Well, before we go too much farther, just wanted to point out one of the books we have available that you may want to consider if you're ever doing cat control. So the Practical Guide to the Control of Feral Cats. And so certainly free-range cats in the United States is a serious issue. But nevertheless, you may want to be in situations where perhaps your state allows you to control cats, perhaps like I was at one time, where I was under health department authorization to manage cats at a particular location. And so whatever the case may be, to give us some tips on how to manage them effectively. So anyways, what are we going to talk about this week? Well, we're going to talk about raccoon roundworms. So I have a series of presentations on this. And so we're going to have actually 3 presentations on this. And so we're going to bring up this particular topic, and so for the next 3 weeks we're going to be covering raccoon roundworm. That's Baylisascaris procyonis, the roundworm of the raccoon. So it's kind of a little bit of a deep dive. If you're not familiar with this particular worm, you should be. I just did some work with a lady who called wildlife control operators out on the East Coast, and some of them were not aware of this worm, which is quite disturbing. So if you're hiring someone to do wildlife control for your property and they're not familiar with this worm, you may want to look at either educating them if you want to do that. Otherwise, perhaps you need to find a different wildlife control operator. So if that happens to be you as a wildlife control operator, well, hopefully you'll find these trainings helpful to introduce you to the world of this particular roundworm. Now, there are other diseases associated with wildlife, but this is one that can be quite serious, has harmed some individuals quite severely. So why don't we get started with that straight away here? Well, first of all, let's talk about what the word means, right? Baylisascaris procyonis. You can see I've broken it down. So Baylis, the Baylis portion, is actually a name of the parasitologist that did a lot of work with this particular worm. And so his name was H.A. Baylis. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit of an homage to him. The ascaris comes from the Greek, which means intestinal worm. So Baylisascaris, okay, and then procyonis is the first word part of the, raccoon. Raccoons are one of the names for a raccoon is procyonis, and that is where it comes pro, meaning before, and then kion, meaning dog, before the dog, and that's because of its hierarchy in how they organize all the various species. But raccoons are one of their names, of course, in the scientific terminology, is the procyonis, and so it's the raccoon roundworm, procyonis. Then, of course, the scientific name for raccoon is Procyon lotor, but procyon means before the dog. So that's what Baylisascaris procyonis means when we break it all the way down, but for our purposes, it's going to be the raccoon roundworm. Why? Because the raccoon is the definitive host for this particular worm. So let's continue on here. If I get my computer working, I apologize. There we go. All right. So one of the things we need to look at, of course, is this egg. And so most people won't eat the worm, right? So we don't have to worry about that too much. The challenge comes in with the egg. And so the egg comes in 2 different versions. the non-infective form, and then the infective form. And if you look carefully at this, you can see the worm that's embryonated right in here. So that is when it becomes infective. So if you've ingested that infective worm, it will break through and then come into your intestines and then migrate into different parts of your body. And it can be rather serious. So what are the characteristics of the worm? Now, keep in mind, the worms you're seeing here are not raccoon roundworms specifically, but they are Ascaris worms. So keep in mind that there are a lot of different varieties of worms out there. Baylisascaris procyonis is one specific worm, but they share a lot of the same features. Think of it like different species of birds. They may be of like in the blue jay family, for example, so they share a lot of characteristics, but there are different species within them. Raccoon roundworm would be one roundworm of the Ascaris category, right? So that's something just important for you to understand, but I couldn't find any photos of the Baylisascaris procyonis that I could use without copyright infringement. So I'm using these Ascaris worms as sort of proxies for what the raccoon roundworm would look like. And so they're tan colored. Females are longer than males, so 20 to 22 centimeters. So you're looking somewhere in the vicinity of 8 inches or so. And then, of course, the males would probably be down about 4 inches long. And so definitely a difference there. And of course, they are tan colored. Now, the egg characteristics, they're ellipsoidal, so they're not perfectly round, but they're an ellipsoid, right? So they kind of have an egg-like look to them. Brown coloration, of course, and then they have a single embryo inside. So you don't have multiple worms inside of a single egg, one worm. And they have a rather thick shell, which makes them quite durable in the environment. And so this is a picture, of course, of the non-infective. So it takes somewhere between 10 to 14 days, depending on the situation. It could take out to a month for the eggs to embryonate. It all depends on the environmental conditions that the egg is located in before it could embryonate. And you can see the size of the eggs here. You have 63 to 88 times by 50 to 70, and those are micrometers, right? Not millimeters, but micrometers. So this is pretty small. You're going to need to have a microscope in order to see it. Now, you may wonder, why do I have a picture of a HEPA filter mask? Well, HEPA filter masks filter down to 0.3 microns. So what that means for you is a regular standard respirator that's HEPA filter capable is more than enough filtration to filter these eggs if they happen to become airborne. Not a problem. So it's very easy for that filter to come through, because 0.3 microns is significantly smaller than 70 microns. Okay, so there's not going to be any issue there. Now, the issue thing you are going to have to think about is whether the seal around your face is intact. That's good. So you're going to need to make sure you do your seal test. But as far as the filtration itself, not a problem whatsoever. So this is the life cycle of this particular worm. Now, it's a little complicated here, so let me kind of break it down for you. So let's start with the eggs. All right, so we have the worms here in the lower right-hand side. Mating, the female then going to be starting to drop some of these eggs. So the eggs are here. Then you have a few weeks till they embryonate, 2 to 4 weeks until they become infective. Then they get picked up sometimes directly by raccoons, or they get picked up, deposited on the ground, for example, and maybe a rabbit starts eating them, and the rabbits, woodchucks, birds can become what's known as an intermediary host. Then the worms become mature, I guess, to a certain degree, then a raccoon may kill the rabbit or kill the bird or eat the carrion if those animals die, and then the raccoon ingests those worms or eggs, and then that cycle becomes complete so that the worms can mate and start giving out more eggs on their own. We as humans, we sometimes can track this particular worm by getting it's possible to eat contaminated meat. That's typically, most people cook their meat well enough so it's not an issue. But if you have children, for example, who are playing in soil that's been contaminated with these eggs because the raccoon sheds them in their feces, and so feces contaminated soil, and the kids are sticking their hands in it. What do kids do? They stick their hands in their mouth and transfer the eggs from the soil into their body. And if they're infective eggs, then those worms can then migrate through their body, causing severe harm to the child. So this is how it primarily works. Now, can we as adults get infected by it? Yes, we can. Typically, though, where we don't stick our fingers in our mouth, and so we're not going to be ingesting the eggs. But it's certainly possible that if there is an incident, we forget, start biting our fingernails or something, we could ingest the eggs that way. There is a chance that the worms will insist in muscle tissue, so they may not migrate to a valuable organ in our case. Like with a child, they're much smaller. The worms sometimes will migrate to the brain, and they can cause severe damage there. Or in the case of some adults, sometimes the worm will migrate its way to our eye and literally eat its way through our eye. We'll show you some pictures of that. So it's a complicated biology in this particular worm. The bottom line for you as someone listening is don't get these eggs inside of your mouth. Okay, that's going to be the key. So you're going to need to be sure you are careful in that regard, because the eggs mature in the small intestine of a raccoon, and that's where the worms will be shedding these eggs, and then the raccoon defecates them out the back end. So in terms of egg production, so we have to have a little bit of a distinction here, because researchers have taken these worms and artificially infected animals. So this information is about a raccoon that's naturally infected. In other words, it just in the course of its ordinary behavior, raccoons are scavengers. They will eat dead animals. They can ingest these particular eggs, and then when the situation become naturally infected. In those situations, raccoons can shed anywhere from 20 to 26,000 eggs a day. So we're dealing with something at the microscopic level. Now, here's the kicker. Juvenile raccoons are more likely to do this more frequently, shed more than the adults. Unclear why, but nevertheless, adults are more likely to be infected because over time they're more likely to grab it, but juveniles will be shedding more eggs. Bottom line, what's the difference between 20,000 eggs and maybe 50,000 eggs? Not sure it really matters much for our purposes here, but nevertheless, we just want to avoid raccoon feces is something that should be treated with care, not paranoia. I'm not wanting to create paranoia here, but just don't be cavalier when you're dealing with raccoon feces. And say, well, why is that? Well, because the eggs can last for a very long time in the soil. So they did some research with these eggs, for example, and they found that those that were stored at 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit, so they're pretty cold, for 9 to 12 years, they could still infect mice. And these eggs can survive in soil, provided the soil has sufficient moisture, for years as well. So don't just think that it's something that's just going to go away after a short period of time if you're dealing with moist soil. Now, the eggs will dry out, but they are quite durable. Now notice I have a very large black ring around around the egg here that I've just sort of created as a diagram. This is because that's what protects the egg and make it so durable. So they have a very tough cellular wall around them. That's what allows these eggs to survive as long as they do, provided it is moist enough, because they will dry out over time if they don't have moisture. So here we have like some cellular fluid here, and then of course you have the egg inside. So let's think of it like a shell that's more durable, that's protecting that egg and allowing it to last in the environment for an exceedingly long period of time. Now, under the right environmental conditions, 11 to 14 days, maybe out to 4 weeks, depending on the environmental conditions, the egg is deposited and then it embryonates. That's when it becomes infective. But under ideal conditions, that's 72 degrees to 77 degrees Fahrenheit with 100% humidity, the eggs will mature within 2 weeks. So what that means for you is that if a raccoon defecates on you, I've heard of stories of people sticking their faces up a chimney and the raccoon poops on their face. That issue is not so much of a risk for a raccoon roundworm because any eggs that are being shed have not been embryonated yet. Now, there are other diseases related to raccoon feces, and so I'm not telling you you're safe. I'm just simply saying that doesn't appear to be the issue with raccoon roundworm is not going to be the primary issue there. So just be careful, right? So you don't know how long, when you're dealing with a raccoon toilet, for example, you don't know how old those eggs are, how long they've been there, but chances are you're going to have to assume that some of those eggs are going to be embryonated. As I mentioned frequently before, the primary means of contamination and infection with this particular worm is ingestion. That means you need to eat it. And it's dose dependent. The bigger you are, the more you weigh, the more eggs you need to ingest to kind of get to that critical mass of getting some sort of serious infection. But understand, these are microscopic eggs, so you're not going to be able to tell whether your dose was high or not, right? It's just not gonna happen. But it does seem to be that the bigger you are, the more likely any type of infection that's going to occur, that the worms may embryonate in muscle tissue and just stay there. And you may not even be aware of that you were infected at one time. So we'll have a presentation that talks about how widespread this infection may be. What are the organisms susceptible to being infected by this worm? Well, over about 155 species. I think that number is actually higher than that now, but don't quote me on that because I'm doing research on another disease like plague. But it's a lot. So understand that this information comes from not only animals discovered naturally infected, but also with researchers who have artificially infected animals to see if they would become infected. So obviously, infection is just because the animal could become infected doesn't mean that they naturally would, because some of this is behavioral based. Okay. But a lot of animals can contract it. So while we're talking about the raccoon, and the raccoon is the definitive animal for this particular roundworm, other animals can be infected and shed eggs potentially as well. So what are some of those particular animal groups? Let's say species groups, okay? Well, 39 rodents, 3 hares, 7 carnivores, 2 bats. I have that wrong. Obviously, bats are not carnivores, right? 24 primates, 14 birds, 1 owl, 11 domestic and wild game birds, 3 pigeons, and by when we say pigeons, I mean like the pigeon group, right? 1 woodpecker, 29 parrots, 1 roadrunner, 6 water birds, and 2 ungulates. So, which is kind of interesting as well. Now, where do these animals, where would they potentially get an infection from? Well, 16 species of mammals and 15 species of birds get infected from latrines. Now, what are they doing around latrines? Well, sometimes seeds don't fully digest inside of a raccoon's system, and so when the raccoon defecates, the seeds come out as well, and then the birds come over and they want to eat those seeds, and then they collect some of those eggs along with the seeds, and then they ingest that and become infected that way. Same way with other animals as well. And these latrines, of course, occur at the base of trees. They're in tree crotches, large logs or stumps. They're on roofs, decks, and that's where the eggs are going to be located. Now, the disease, when you contract this particular disease, it's called larval migrans. In other words, think of it as, I like to look at it as migration. So think of it as a worm. You ingest the eggs, they're infective eggs, so they're embryonated. The worm breaks out of the egg, goes through your intestinal wall, follows the bloodstream, and finds a place to sort of hang out. And it can go to different locations. You can see there's the visceral larval migraines, the ocular, meaning the eye, the neural, getting into your brain, and then cutaneous. This is where sometimes the worm may just be underneath your skin. Okay, so that's cutaneous exposure. The first recorded human infection occurred in Pennsylvania with a 10-month-old child, which makes perfect sense. The kid's crawling along the ground, gets contamination on their hands, and then, of course, what do kids do? They stick their hands inside their mouth, and the kid contracted it. This is a devastating illness because the worm will migrate its way up into the baby's brain and then do some significant damage. And then the inflammation as the body's trying to fight off the worm causes additional swelling and damage to the child. And so the child basically becomes a vegetable, is what happens. Here's visceral. This is where the worm is inside the intestinal area. And you can see the worms hanging out in here. It's kind of not the best sight in the world. Yes, you can get raccoon roundworm in your eye, and it's a little hard to see in this particular picture, but if you follow my cursor, there's a worm there. Now, this hasn't been officially diagnosed as raccoon roundworm. However, the photographer that memory serves said that it's highly likely that this is raccoon roundworm. And so what the worm does, it actually eats its way through your eye tissue. Now, fortunately, in the eye area, it can be treated, at least stopping additional damage. So they will use a laser and shoot the laser in to kill the worm so that it's not doing any more chewing damage. Think of it like how does a worm work? Well, a worm just eats its way through the soil, right? Well, in this case, the worm is just eating its way through your eye tissue, and so it's quite severe. Now, neurological, obviously I'm not a radiologist here, so bear with me, but you can see here's a 13-month-old boy 12 days after symptoms emerged, and you can see some swelling here in these MRI images, and that is what's occurring. It's where the arrows are looking at. There's some swelling and inflammation, and that's what causes tremendous brain injury, and it has significant intellectual impacts as well. So this is a very serious infection. So let me bottom line this for you. If you're not already aware of it, raccoon roundworm is a significant and serious zoonotic disease. That means it's a disease that comes from animals, wild animals, and can infect humans. Wildlife control operators, pest management professionals need to be thinking about this worm and protecting themselves and their loved ones and their clients, particularly when they're working around raccoon toilets, but whenever they're dealing with fecal material that could be potentially contaminated with raccoon roundworm or any worm. Like I tell when I give instruction, poo is bad, don't touch that, right? So we want to be sure that we're treating that appropriately, and we'll give you some strategies in future presentations on how to deal with that. Never keep a raccoon for a pet. I know some people, I had a raccoon pet as a kid. It's a really bad idea, not to mention, I believe many states have banned that sort of activity in any way, so it's illegal. But you shouldn't have a raccoon as a pet because the raccoon, if that raccoon's infected, can be shedding these eggs, and it really requires a high level of care and concern on your part so you don't infect yourself and you don't contaminate equipment that your children or family members may be getting involved with as well. Well, that's basically part one of my three-part series on raccoon roundworm. And so if you're already intrigued or scared and you want to pay attention to the next two presentations where we continue our talk on this significant disease, do hope you take a few moments, if you would, to reach out and contact me. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear your thoughts, criticisms, suggestions for new shows. I actually have created a show from a comment from a viewer that will be coming out after this three-part series. It'll be on carbon monoxide injectors. So thanks to that individual for reaching out. And I'm going to try to revisit carbon monoxide injectors. So we'd love to have you contact me even if you have a criticism. So you can, again, reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And then, of course, if you're looking for training materials or perhaps me giving a training for your particular company, you can reach me as well and chat about that particular issue. So that's part one on raccoon roundworm. And this is the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a scientific point of view. All right, well, that's it for this week. Until next time, take care, everyone.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.